Well, greetings and welcome to today's webinar on coaching noxious leaders and their followers. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending from where you're dialing in today. We are so grateful to have you joining us. My name is Stephanie Gerard, and I am the Manager of Education, Marketing, and Research at the Institute of Coaching. And today we are so fortunate to have two of our very own IOC leaders with us. Presenting on today's topic is Carol Kauffman, with Jeff Hull as the moderator. While folks are signing in, I'll just go over a few housekeeping details. As always, we welcome your questions during the webinar. Please feel free to send us your questions via the webinar question function, and Carol will try to answer as many questions as possible throughout this hour and 15-minute session. Due to the high participation, all attendee audio has been muted to avoid any background noise. And as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the library section of the ICPA website within a week. Finally, there will be a survey following the webinar, and we would appreciate it if everyone would complete the survey. Your feedback is so important to us. If you are looking to receive any CEUs, you are required to complete the survey. And now I would like to hand it over to Jeff.
Thank you, Stephanie, and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or good evening, as Stephanie said, from around the world. We want to welcome you to this month's webinar. My name is Jeff Hull, and I'm the Director of Education and Business Development at the Institute of Coaching. And I am thrilled to be hosting this webinar today with my colleague and my very dear friend, the founder and executive director of the Institute of Coaching, Carol Kauffman. Carol's going to play a little bit against type today, I think, since many of you may know Carol or know of her work as an expert in the use of the theories of positive psychology and coaching. But she's also been busy working, researching, and studying what she's calling noxious leaders and their followers and how to coach them to success. And so she has a lot of exciting material to cover with us today. And I don't want to take too long to get us started other than to just go over a little bit of our structure and also to share a bit of Carol's background for anyone who's not familiar with her work. So as far as the way we'll structure the webinar today, we will have an hour and 15 minutes together. And we want to try to get in as many questions as we can, and though there's a large number of folks on the line, so what we're going to recommend you do is as we go through the webinar, please feel free to send us your questions through the chat function. And Carol and I will take breaks 2 or 3 times during the session, and I will pass on questions to her. I will warn you that having done this a number of times, it's often difficult to get all the questions in. So feel free to follow up with us afterwards if you feel like we missed your question and it's important to you. We absolutely want to hear from you, and we will continue the dialogue after the webinar. We'll try to leave the last 10 minutes or so to really get into dialogue and hear from you any examples or case studies or specific things you'd love to get Carol's feedback on. A little bit about Carol's background before we get started. Many of you may be familiar with Carol if you've come to our conference or if you've been on other webinars, but she is the founder and the executive director of the Institute of Coaching and also an assistant clinical professor at Harvard Medical School. In 2009, she received a $2 million gift from the Harnish Foundation and was able to use that money to establish the Institute and its education and research mission in the professionalization of the coaching or the forwarding of the coaching profession. Carol is also a diplomat of the American Board of Professional Psychology and is an examiner for the board, as well as the chief supervisor for Myler Campbell Limited in the UK, a business coaching program based in London. So needless to say, we are very excited to have our resident expert on the line, and we're honored to have her with us today. And I want to turn it over to Carol and get started with our work. Hi, Carol.
Hey there, Jeff. And everybody, Jeff is my right and left-hand person, who's the Director of Education and Business Development. And great guy who's hosted some webinars of his own, so please look through our library to find them. Well, I went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth on what to call today, and I wound up calling it Coaching Noxious Leaders and Their Followers. And what we're going to do is first look at the impact of being a leader, which I'd like you to keep in mind is also, as coaches, we are leaders. We're going to then look at the experience from the context of the person who's receiving the coaching and the transmitter of coaching. And then implicit in that, when I talk about the turnaround terrorist, is sometimes the organization pushes someone to engage in behaviors that we think of as noxious. We'll then do 3 coaching vignettes. So, okay, I'm having a little trouble here. Here we go. All right, so what I think will be very interesting today is the implications for coaching, and I really want to invite you all to send in your questions about that. To start with, I kid around that I learned everything I needed to know about leadership development when I was 7, when my girlfriend said a joke where a 1,000-pound gorilla walks into a really crowded bar. Where does it sit? The answer is anywhere it wants. And why is that relevant? It's relevant because if you are impacting the well-being of a person, their income, their promotion, the viability of their project, you are the 1,000-pound gorilla. And the leader is always a 1,000-pound gorilla. And part of the coaching is to help them never forget it. And a gorilla can be a CEO. The gorilla can be a teacher. Really, again, when you are between someone and what they want, you are experienced as the gorilla, no matter how it is that you actually experience yourself. And also, the whole issue is, particularly from an organization or even in coaching, what kind of gorilla do you need to be? Do you need to kind of really take a stand, whether or not it's directive, but to be very powerful in an interaction, or cuddly, like we see Coco's kitten, the gorilla who had a kitten as a pet? So then the question is, you know, why are we looking at impact and leadership impact and why it fits into life today? So many of you have heard of VUCA, where life is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. In times like this, leaders need to be much more agile. And it really doesn't work to be in some of the headset of the past, because the leaders are all trained, as are we, to look at the world from the position of the tube line on the left, which is the London tube line where I spend much of my time. But in fact, the world looks like that. Things that were linear are no longer linear. We cannot predict what is going on. Life is confusing. And when you have something like that, a hierarchical model just doesn't work anymore. In life today, you really can't expect a linear model. By that I mean an ounce of effort will result in an ounce of outcome. What we all find is that you can put in 20 pounds of effort, nothing happens, nothing happens, nothing happens, and then suddenly at some point it pivots and everything happens. And the reverse. You can actually, particularly with a high-end coaching client, put in an ounce of effort and 20 pounds of result pops out. But the other thing about the leaders is, when you look at those squiggly lines, is no one can be a champion on their own. No one can win a championship on their own. This is where each person needs to have opposing strengths simultaneously. Any leader needs, on one hand, to really shine themselves, and the other is to really shine in terms of raising up the level of the team and being invisible. So also we see that out there in the world, a lot of these leaders are still in this headset of it's up to me, I've got to lead, I need special qualities as a leader. And these mindsets are like ocean liners. They take a long time to change. And once even they do change, nobody sees it for a while. And the other one is a CEO or any leader really actually doesn't know what's happening in the organization. You know, down the pike, people are doing what they're doing, and maybe you find out about it, maybe you don't. So leadership by your modeling, your mission, influence rather than direct control, all of these things are key. And what you really need as a leader in order to operate in very fast shifting winds is to have your rudder in the water. And ideally to have your rudder in the water all the way down. And you can't command that to happen. This has to happen as you create a culture and one that is safe and collective. And so, as you can see here, it's really important for people to be free to speak and be heard. That can only happen if you have psychological safety. And we have a wonderful webinar by Amy Edmondson on psychological safety and teaming. How you get to psychological safety, and this is just as true in the coaching relationship as it is in an organization, is really staying in a strengths place. And when you're working with a leader behaving badly, that can be an incredible challenge. And what we need to do is to really try to shift to a position of psychological safety. So now I'm just going to walk you through some of the very recent research. And all of this is based on lots and lots of studies. What I did 2 days at the Academy of Management meeting in Philadelphia is I went to every single talk on basically bad, compromised leaders. And this is based on some very good research. And on one hand, it may seem obvious, but on the other, I think it's good to know that what our intuitive responses are to these leaders is very much evidence-based. And there's a lot of work on the reduced job satisfaction, well-being, and how engaged people are. What happens when they're silenced? A really interesting result for me is when one person mapped abusive behavior in an organization, the place it happened the most was actually in peer-to-peer interaction. I would have thought, and today focuses more on the leader and the follower, but in fact, it really does permeate everything, and it ripples out. So one way to think about it if you're working with someone, I think it's helpful to kind of have a sense of what are the negative impacts so we can begin to know what to focus on, questions to ask someone. One part that I find really fascinating is, what is it that makes noxious leadership behaviors so powerful and different? And a lot of these studies have tried to look specifically at how painful leadership can affect your self-esteem. And we'll talk more about what it's like to be the recipient of the abuse soon. So here's the very latest research, which is, as an extra kind of precaution, I put sort of coaching abusive and blah, blah, blah leaders, and was thrilled to see at the top of the Google this article on the Institute of Coaching website, which I will confess I missed. And this one is really fascinating, speaks to the peer-to-peer as well, and this is an article you can just find on our LinkedIn site about just how basically one bad apple affects them all. And this is very important to us in terms of really when you're coaching these people, how to create some solidarity so the team doesn't suffer as much. Jeff mentioned some research that I am involved with Larry Harmon and Paul Gregory. There's a very specific survey, basically 360, created just for physicians, and this data is based on about 523 physician leaders. These are just leaders of all types, and there's another study just on physicians who are in trouble. So what we did is looked at what behaviors are most key. And why these 6 behaviors are most key is it can really help you when you are working with a leader to identify key behaviors to work on in the coaching. And really, the number one, as you'll see for all of them, is treating team members with respect. That encompasses a huge, huge number of behaviors. So it's very important to be able to admit when you're wrong, be approachable even when you're stressed, and be open to suggestions. The correlations between these behaviors and work environment was something called an R of 0.8, which is basically really high. It means that a big, big impact and the variance that's associated with leadership behavior is very high. So we also saw the worst in leadership behaviors. They intentionally embarrass team members. They're not truthful. They're not straightforward. They snap at others. They overreact to feedback or questions. And you can see they create a closed system where they're less likely to hear what's going on, less likely to find their blind spots, and as you can imagine, performance can go down. It can pop up in the beginning, but then go down. One other aspect in this sort of treating team members with respect or not is also shunning people when a leader can just not hear others or be invisible to others. So what I'd like to do now is if there's any questions, Jeff, to pause here before I move into what it's like to receive the impact and what it's like to be someone who is a tough leader. Are there some questions we can pause on?
Not getting questions yet. I think people are probably just beginning to assimilate some of the framework that you're talking about. What I would ask, though, is this research that you were pointing to with Larry Harmon and Paul Gregory was on physician leaders.
Yes.
And having myself worked with physician leaders, but also with leaders in a whole lot of other organizational contexts, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about whether there's a unique type of noxiousness that goes on with physician leaders or whether this is pretty correlative across like all different kinds of organizational leaders. Anything that you've noticed that's different in different organizational contexts?
Great question. Thank you. I've just finished 2 major leadership development programs, one with a fast-moving consumer goods company that I can name because the work has been published, Unilever. And we worked with 750 of those leaders. I probably worked personally with 100. And this really fits the toughies and some of the things that I had to take my coaching baseball bat out and challenge people. So this seems very relevant. I then finished about a 150 leader program with a pharmaceutical company, and these are the big behaviors as well. What isn't really embodied here is how the people who engage in the worst leadership behaviors also have incredible strengths. They tend to work incredibly hard. They take a huge amount of responsibility. As a result, they have more stress, which then spikes out in these directions. Mostly back to what I said earlier is they're not good at collective leadership. Very often these leaders are subject matter experts who have shot up because they're really good at a couple of things, and leadership is a very different behavior. And often leaders aren't really trained to be leaders. So that's my take on that. That this seems very representative.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you think about physicians, to your point about achievement and success and stress, and it's almost as if they are, they epitomize sort of the pinnacle of what would be true of all organizational dynamics, but particularly true in the physician situation where you're often dealing with life and death or surgery. Or so it's interesting that this research sort of focuses on those behaviors in that context.
Yes, and just I think it's also true to stress in general. Even if
Right.
it isn't actually life and death, when you're in the fire, you experience that way. The pharma company that I just was working with was the subject of a hostile takeover during the year and a half I was involved with them, which they won. They didn't get taken over. But the stress was ginormous, and you could see people polarize as a result and become either better or worse versions of who they were. And in this case, how the Leadership Development Program, which was partnered with Harvard Business School and Authentic Leadership, how the program was there at the perfect time, because when people really got the sense of what's their purpose, their team's purpose, their bigger purpose, and how it connected to the larger organization, was incredibly helpful. And as you can see here that, toxicity or positivity is catching, and there's a lot of very good neuroscience on this, which I'm not going to go in today, but there's great work by Richard Boyatzis, Richard Davies, and a number of people that talk about how these emotions, how this treatment is contagious. And as a result, how can we be very alert and help the people that we're working with? Again, I'm primarily working with leaders, and so that's why this is my frame. But everything I'm saying is, I think, extremely relevant if you are a health coach and you're working with a patient with diabetes, if you are working with teachers, if you're working with parents. Again, everybody is a gorilla to somebody. And we can even think about these things in terms of our own parenting. So I want to start first about, I'm calling it the recipient. And there's a reason I'm calling it the recipient. So this is the person receiving the noxious or abusive behavior. I just got off the phone today, and I may talk about this case a little bit more, with the CEO of the pharma company that I was talking about earlier, who was rattled beyond belief because of the abuse of one of the people who worked for her. So this really goes all ways. And what I'm interested in is what influences the power of the negative reaction. So years ago, I was, sitting around the dinner table with this woman. I don't know how we got to the subject, but she said that her family was like the family in Moonstruck, which was this family that just fought all the time but truly did love each other. And she said, but, still it got worse than that, and sometimes it was violent. She spoke about an interaction with her father, and he was then furious at what she did, really furious, is screaming, slapping the table. And so she ran upstairs, went into the bathroom, locked herself in. He comes running after her and pounding on the door, eventually kicks it down. And I'm there thinking, how terrifying. So I just looked at her, totally imagining me cowering in the corner, terrified of what this man would do. And I asked her, what did you do? She said, what did I do? I told him, now that's pretty stupid. Now you got to fix the door. And I walked out of the bathroom. That brought home to me more than anything how people experience things differently. This would have been traumatizing to me, and it was a non-event for her. And she just sort of said what she said and left. So here it's very important that emotional reactions differ. One person's annoyance can be another person's abuse, depending on who they are, what they've experienced. So again, why? What is it about the stressful, noxious boss that actually is so difficult? And how we absorb it, unless we're one of those people where it's water off a duck. And by the way, very often I work with people to develop what I call how something can happen and you can water off a duck it, and try to help yourself get to a place where you don't absorb this behavior. What you do see in the research is that there's energy drain, that there's lowered engagement, and you can react either with positive anger, where you're able to confront the person, or negative anger, where you go to revenge. But then the big thing is, how do you make sense of what's happening? And this was core to the coaching I did today, where my CEO didn't know about sociopaths. And when she described this person's horrible behavior and their charmingness and saying one thing and denigrating her to the board and then being sweet to her, it just doesn't make sense. And very often what's very important in the extremes is the behavior doesn't make sense. Most of the time we're dealing with a noxious leader who is what I think of as a mammal. They are a little predictable. Maybe they're a big puppy, maybe they're a guard dog, even a lion. We kind of can have a sense of what mammals do. The extreme leaders are like reptiles. You cannot predict what a snake or a crocodile will do, which is very much connected to one of the books that I'll tell you about, Snakes in Suits. You can't really figure them out. But the big one is also attribution. What do you make of what's going on? Many people will think, what's wrong with me? Or you'll feel isolated. So how can you connect the dots of the person's behavior, how you feel, how the team feels, and help work with that attribution? Also, when we're stressed, we have narrowed attention, and that can result in your being less creative, but also less resourceful. And in the really tough situation, it breaks down, whatever you do, it's completely unrelated to your boss's reaction or to your report's reaction or your peers' reaction. And the most difficult leaders are those who are great some of the time and then really noxious the rest of the time. So now we'll look at some implications for the coaching. Again, when you're exploring someone's background, how can you help them see how they've really worked well in the past? And here's some kind of coaching questions you can ask them. When have they been successful? When have they managed difficult relationships at work, at home, and help them build on the strengths that they have? And this is the positive psychology piece. Then, what kind of communication works? Sometimes these people can hear you. A lot of times they can't. Very often, if what you do is just name a behavior but not ask the person to change, it's a little less stressful for the noxious leader, who then may not react as strongly. But a lot of times they just do. And what's very important then is how can you get support from others? Because if you have even one person that really, really you can understand them and they can understand you, it makes a huge difference in how you experience the situation. So the other thing to look at, again, is the stress that they receive and how is it that they can manage that stress more effectively. And again, a lot of that is what we're already, the mindfulness, the positive psychology interventions, looking at what is good regardless of what's bad, and that is in the boss and also in yourself and also in your organization. And how can you find other motivation? It says people don't leave jobs, they leave bosses. But during the time you're there, how can you really pull on your own motivation and purpose to really get a sense of how you can proceed regardless? So what I'd like for us to do now is also pause and get a sense of if there's some questions now about coaching situations where you have been or your client has been working with a noxious or abusive boss. Maybe share in a few sentences maybe what's worked, what's exploded in your face. So Jeff, are there any questions that have come in at this time?
Yes, there are. And I think there's some folks that are looking for some clarity around some of the things that you've shared.
Yeah, good.
So one thing is about this idea of negative versus positive anger. You mentioned that earlier, and if you could speak a little bit more, because I think that's maybe a frame that's interesting and perhaps new for some people to think of anger itself having a valence, a positive or a negative valence.
Very simple. There you are with your child. someone threatens your child, you get angry and you protect your child. So positive anger is anger that is motivated by protecting someone or protecting yourself, and also at that point not going into vengeance. And it could be as a coach. How can you be fueled by positive confrontation for someone? So for example, I was working with an extraordinarily dysfunctional, abusive man. And at one point in the coaching, I literally said, is it really, he was talking about, he actually said that he did not lose control, that he screamed at people, and he choreographed who would be the witnesses to his destroying another individual who worked for him. So positive confrontation, and that made me angry, not at him really, but at the situation. And so I confronted him by saying, are people here afraid of you? He didn't respond. And I said, are they afraid of you, yes or no? And then he could say yes. And then I say, does that serve you? Is this really who you want to be? I don't see that as the kind of negative or destructive anger. It was constructive conversation, constructive confrontation, and helped him kind of wake up. Because a lot of these guys need to be woken up. They don't really see what they're doing. He thought he was destroying evil people, and that was just fine. So I don't know if that helps with that question. What's the next question?
Let's see here. Hold on one second.
It's great that you have to pick because there's so many.
Yes, there's quite a few things coming in. They're coming in rapidly. So, I think a number of people are very interested in exploring, and I'm sure you are actually going to continue with this, but exploring further about getting the leaders' buy-in to change. A couple of questions coming in around whether or not they're actually aware. As coaches, I think we're always running into this, whether there's a sense that the noxious leader kind of knows what he or she is doing and doesn't even want to change, or whether it's really coming from a place of unconsciousness. And so the questions are related to moving them to a place where not only they have an awareness about the impact, but also want to change.
Well, those are perfect questions, and I am going to get to them, and I could start now. What I would like to say is, for those of you listening, please don't hold back with the questions. I'll tell you why. I am in the middle of writing about this topic, and your questions, particularly where I'm not clear or confusing you, will actually be helpful to me in my writing. And I hope I can follow through on this. But what I may also do is just write up some quick answers later to some of the questions that aren't getting answered now. So please don't think, oh, my question's not important or she won't have time, because this is important to me. Oh, I forgot to. Forgive me. So the first two things were, how do you work with the background and how do you kind of work with self-depletion? These are two more that I mentioned a bit about earlier, which is when you're working with the client and also with the leader, how to step back and look at the experience and connect the dots. Again, whether you're internalizing the abuse and blaming yourself or you're externalizing it and blaming the other, it's really good to try to take the other person's position for a moment, just to get a sense of, if you're the leader, try to get the experience of your follower. If you're a follower, try to get the experience of your leader, not letting them off the hook, but trying to just see where they might be coming from. And when you have that lack of empowerment, the real focus then becomes, where can you take control? Where can you be in charge? And how can you feel empowered? And to kind of use these as ways to help the client kind of remember where they're strong, particularly when they're in a situation where the leader can't wake up or won't wake up. How can you use self-determination theory? And we have master classes on that, where your basic needs are for autonomy, relatedness, and competence. And how can you help your client find places where they can be autonomous and in control, find relationships that will help them, and claim their own competence. So what is it like for the abusive leader? Very often, inside the leader is the chimp. So when I was telling you the story about the gorilla in a crowded bar, what happens is, imagine a gorilla throwing its arms to the side and just going, what is happening? And the bodies go falling and being thrown or are damaged. But the person can feel like a chimp and not be listened to. So that is most of the leaders who I find that are very fierce. Inside is a chimp. Not always true, but important to kind of process that. So here's some of the things, again, to think about when you're coaching one of these tough leaders. Are their behaviors what they're doing or who they are? The research is showing that you can have an abusive leader, which has an obviously negative impact, but if they are also exploitive, the exploitive part has a huge impact. And the exploitation part is when the leader takes credit for things you've done, using people for their own gain. At that point, you're talking about a serious issue. So again, when you are working with one of these people, to be curious about what drives this. You know, how do they see it? You know, what is in their past, their present, their imagination of the future that's going on? And then sense-making. What's the assumptions the leader has about what raises performance, particularly then when you're in a turnaround situation and there's huge pressure on someone to, you know, save the particular country from, you know, having their market share so down that chances are it's going to compromise the company. And what do you do? And so they come in like big gorillas and wreak havoc. And here they will pull on behavior patterns from the past. And again, their culture clashes. So I'll pause first. If it's really who they are abusive and exploitive, they have no interest in changing, and you know that they're charming, they lie a lot, etc., I think then all bets are off. And sociopaths are about 2% of the population. They're very hard to spot. And as I described, the CEO called me this morning, and her sense of the world got destabilized. And she was thinking, can I trust anybody? You know, I've been trusting people. My policy is to trust people till they prove they're untrustworthy. And it was helpful for her to remind her, A, to let her know it was a sociopath. She didn't recognize those behaviors, and it was very helpful. And she felt far less crazy. The other issue is when you have someone like that, I do believe that 90% of the time a true sociopath isn't really coachable, maybe a bit. The guy I mentioned earlier, who I believe veered in that direction, he was at the beginning of a program, and a couple of years later I was coaching his boss. And I said, remember so-and-so? Because it became urban legend, because later on I asked him if he was comfortable being evil. And he actually talked about this with a lot of people, wound up referring to me. I said, did he actually change? Because inside I felt he was playing me. It wasn't real. And he said, oh, yeah, so-and-so is still an asshole. But you know, now when he attacks people, he stops and apologizes. Sometimes that's the most that you can do, and that is success. And here are 2 books, The Sociopath Next Door, Snakes in Suits. There's another one called Almost a Psychopath that can really help you get the cluster of behaviors of these people. So
Carol?
again, yes, Jerry?
Hey, just we have a couple questions along this line, so it might be good for you to just...
Okay, perfect. Pause here. Yep.
Yeah, just in terms of framing that distinction between whether it's sociopathy or psychopathy and the abusive leader. And I know that in some of the work that I've done with people in this sort of domain, that one thing that shows up often is that the true psychopath actually doesn't even get angry. I mean, they don't actually have the emotional context, and they, it's really more around manipulation and power, looking good. And I'm curious, so that when you're working with someone who is highly emotional, they're probably not a psychopath. And I'm curious if you've yourself have any kind of framework that you use to sort of find the distinction.
Well, these two books were helpful. Also, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for the Psychology Diagnosis. But yes, these people are different. As I think of it, I mean, they are reptiles in terms of they really do not have attachments in any real way. Right. So the irony is very often if a boss is angry at you, there's a connection that they have, which means they are attached. It may be negative, but they are attached.
Right.
So when you're working with these people, you really think about what sets them up to be this way. And you can start getting them to wake up by asking them what really matters to them. So if you're working with someone who seems abusive, you can really, as we'll see later in a case, just ask them what really matters to you. And then what you do is you connect the behavior that's being requested to change with what matters to them. Then they can be willing to wake up and smell the coffee. My guy was going to be fired at the end of the week if he didn't have a significant transformation. That really led to wanting to a lot of change. He wasn't told that directly, but he picked it up. So that's one thing, is find out what matters to them, connect the behavior that needs to change with what matters to them. And it can be very idiosyncratic and surprising. The other thing is, what problem are they trying to solve? Is it serving them? Then again, you can start asking them questions that get to what is their mindset. Do they believe that other people want to grow? Do they think other people are lazy? What is their mindset, and how can you challenge them? So, for example, they think a peer is an idiot. What you might suggest is, let's do an experiment. I'd like you to think of the negative behavior about this person and put it in a circle. Imagine a piece of paper, and you put this in a circle. Okay, so you could say this person is always late and doesn't come through. Then imagine drawing 5 more circles and asking the person, I'm curious, could you think of anything this person has ever done that you respect or are grateful for, or they have gone the extra mile? And they can start filling in those circles with other behaviors to give them a more balanced view. So that's one way you can try to help them reverse the focus and see something different about the person that they are angry at. The other, of course, is the 360. A really good 360, particularly an interview 360, can give you enormous power. Here's one thing, is they can say, well, it's not, that feedback's not true. And you can counter with, but this is the story people have of you. So whether it's true or not, what can we do to help change the story? And then that gets you around the this isn't true thing. Very often, noxious behavior is an overused strength, where they believe that the way they are behaving, for example, one person really believed in being truthful. And being truthful meant I could just go, bleh. Anything I think I should say because I'm being truthful, without realizing he was a gorilla, and that being truthful was just venting and not taking the other person into account, and he had a lot of work to do around that. The other one is developing agility. I was working with one rather fierce woman who was trying to make a decision about firing someone or talking to them, and her choice was, I say it or I don't. So at that point, I will look at the person and say, okay, those are limited choices. I'd like to hear another pathway, another choice, another choice. So ideally, you want the person to have some kind of agility so that they can have another way to think. And that is another great question that Nancy Klein, who wrote Time to Think, uses When the person is done, you simply ask, what else do you think? What else can you think? Can you expand what you think? So that is one other way. The other thing is a lot of people get stuck in early leadership behaviors where what you do is you produce. But at a higher level, you have to work through others, and the collaboration becomes more important. That's one thing to hold up to them that can inspire them to change, that this is higher level leadership. And what do you need to do now to be successful? Because your sharp elbows are going to hurt you. I live near a train, so excuse the background noise if you can hear it. The other part is to see what positive patterns they can use more often. When I started doing this work, I was a little quick to say that people were sociopaths. And Richard Kilberg, who is a major coach in the United States, countered with me, which I was surprised because he's a psychoanalyst. I thought he would just go to town with negative interpretations. And he described it as these are behavioral memes, behavioral patterns that have served these people in the past. And how do we shift from that? And again, we can look at culture clashes in an organization, how sometimes abuse is, a Dutch or a German is working with a Japanese or an Asian person. Very, very different styles of communicating. So your quote, unquote, bluntness can be something that is incredibly offensive, and you are being abusive without really knowing it. So again, more implications for coaching as we work with the gorillas.
Carol, quick question in here.
Yeah.
Especially in terms of what you were just saying about Dick Kilberg and the fact that in many cases some of these behaviors are the response or the result of long-term narratives of success, like defense narratives. People have developed behaviors that work for them because of earlier experiences in their lives. I'm curious, knowing that you're a psychologist, knowing that you're psychoanalytically trained along with positive psychology, where do you bring the psychology into your coaching sessions? Like, how often do you actually even explain to people or bring up the possibility that this behavior may be a defense mechanism, that it may be something that they have developed as a response to early childhood experience? Do you leave that completely out of your coaching? Do you ever bring it in? What's your sort of best practice around that?
Well, I typically don't. I never use the word, I think this is defensive on your part.
Right.
I will say, what set you up to do this? What has set you up? And then I could say, so when's the very first time you used this behavior? And if they just stay with work, I'll say, well, you've been who you are for a long time. What about before then? What were your early models of what's leadership and behavior? How were you treated? So I may do it again if they feel open to it, which is, when you sort of say, well, what happened before you started working, whether they get interested or whether they bristle. And so you do need to sort of follow their energy. So I would say that's how I bring it in. And it's also kind of in my bones in terms of what I'll see as cause and effect. And in particular, though, really how they are accidentally creating this situation that's making life horrible for them. I will not talk about repetition compulsion, but that's what it is in terms of how is your not listening to people, how is your being brusque, actually creating them. As I said to actually the CEO I talked to today, a year or so ago, she was talking about how passive-aggressive everybody was, to which I said, you are seen as the warrior woman. People are often afraid to speak to you. What if all this passive-aggressive behavior was due to you? What might that look like? She was sort of amazed and got it. So that's one where I actually named it, and that is unusual. And I knew this woman was really open to strong feedback because no one does it. And again, as an external trusted advisor, I believe I started that intervention by saying, I've been listening to you for 20 minutes. You're a very powerful woman. I'm just so amazed at how you could present yourself as a passive victim when you're the CEO of the company. So that's not my typical style, but it can work. So now I'd like to move to just some quick vignettes. The first one is, these are all people I'm supervising. Much of my time actually now is supervising leadership coaches, which is great because a lot of them are actually better than I am, but they still have a lot of questions and the different perspectives are helpful. So again, here's a woman who's working for a CEO with very toxic behavior, screaming, overruling, devaluing, not seeing anything. I mean, really horrible. And all normal interventions that she made didn't work. And so she's stuck because she was high up in the food tree and there wasn't anywhere else to go right then. The intervention by the person I was supervising was just so simple, which was really helping her understand that her feeling disempowered and unable to speak wasn't her, that this was really the CEO, and how, again, could she simply be able to make sense of it. Without making sense of it, what she would do is he would say something outrageous, and she would fight with him. And she would push back and argue, which would only escalate him, which would only make her more upset, and then she would come back harder, et cetera, et cetera. And then she learned to not play that game, to not feel like her competence was based on changing his mind, but in this case, stepping away and being able to protect her people. So that's the first case, and maybe I'll go through three, but maybe for this first one, you can write some questions in. The second one, this guy, this one was really funny. So the guy's the CEO of a major firm, turned it around. They went from losing money to gaining money. He's the big kahuna now. His, pushing the locomotive and the train has been successful. Now what? He's won the revolution, but he can't lead the peace. So she walks in. He goes, I don't really see why in the world these people think I need a coach. This is ridiculous. Oh my goodness. They're stupid, they're this, they're that. And so he then turns away from her and plays with his iPhone. She was furious and decided that she shouldn't intervene while she was furious. So she sat there for 15 minutes. He's still ignoring her, and she finally says, listen, I'm paid by the minute too, so you can start engaging with me whenever you want. He is very surprised, looks up, and she says to him, listen, what really matters to you? What matters to you? He then went on and on and on about how much he loves the firm, it's like a child, and this and that, and this and that, and this and that, and sort of went off for about 15 or 20 minutes. And when he finished, she said, oh, thank you. Would you like me to leave now? Because he still hasn't said he wants the coaching. He was very shocked and said no, and started talking. And then her question at that moment was to wake him up. If this firm matters so much to you, do you think these behaviors are hurting its future? Now he cared. She got him to really open up to see what was important to him, and that these behaviors were absolutely pivotal. Her style, she's a very powerful coach. She's funny, she's warm, so she could just kind of like smack him around with the wisecracks. I'm paid by the minute, should I go, et cetera, et cetera. But we all have very different sets of strengths. So this is one that was equally powerfully effective, but a very different energy. So it's a leadership development meeting. The guy's in front of the moon, in front of the room. There's this 6'4", really gorgeous blonde guy, sprawled out, not paying attention, on his iPhone. Then when they did group work, he stepped back and disengaged, which really was disruptive. The coach had the capacity to point it out and do it in the session. He did not wimp out. but he felt that was not strategic. So he found the right time, went over to the person later and said, is it all right? I have some observations if you'd like to hear them. So the guy said, yes. So first, this leadership coach said, you know, when we looked over the pre-work and whatever, you actually prepared more than anyone. You brought incredible ideas to the table, and no one has said some of the things as interesting as you. By the way, he was telling the truth. You can't do this if you don't believe it. So he named this. And then he said, and I saw some behavior that you were leaning back, you were on your iPhone, you stepped back. I'm curious, what's the message you think you're sending to everyone without saying a word? So he wasn't in the room. The coach said, I really want to invite you to participate. And the guy said, well, I want to. He said, well, you know, I can multi-process. It's like, well, your message is too strong for that. And not only did the guy step into the room, which of course changed the energy, changed the ripple effect, but he then actually asked to continue the coaching. So again, see the world as they do, don't catch it. Make sure to not save that victim or damn the perpetrator. Really be open, because life is always more complicated than we think. Each person needs to understand their role. Even if it's 2%, 5%, they need to understand their own role. And as I said before with the person, name the strengths or the stakes if they don't change. The other thing is to remember Prochaska's work on the stages of change. So if they're in pre-contemplation, like this isn't a problem, you got to wake them up. And you can do that through feedback, your observations. If they're totally not open to it, you say, so again, I think this is really affecting your brand and how people are experiencing you and what that impact will be on your future. Now, if they're a little bit open but not ready to act, you just ask questions and explore with them. You know, what do you think this might be? What's going on for other people? Does this serve you? Just to think. Then you move into the other work of preparation, which may be them really looking at the 360, action, changing their behaviors. It is inevitable they will fall, and how they can then get up again. So in a nutshell, I've just shared a lot of information. I hope some of it's useful to your coaching, and I'd love to hear your questions over the next 10 or 15 minutes that we have together.
So Carol, one of the things that's coming in strong here from quite a few folks is tips that you would have, especially since you're doing supervision of other coaches, to how to stay centered yourself as a coach in the face of noxious behavior. So, you know, you've got those situations where the coaching session itself is an opportunity where the leader is demonstrating his or her bad behavior. And, you know, you've been sharing with us a lot of different varied techniques for how to bring that into the conversation. But I think some of the folks out there are listening in, are curious about what things the coach can do for themselves to sort of stay grounded, stay strong, stay present, you know, all of the above when you're in the face of what can be a pretty tough energy.
Yes. Thank you for the people who asked that question. I love it. It speaks to a number of things. It speaks to your sense of identity, the whole topic of countertransference. What does this bring up for you in your background? Are you experiencing this as abusive? Are you experiencing it as a fun fight? All of that. I do have one primary answer to that, which helps me a lot, which is I remind myself I am there to serve. I am there to serve the person. I am there to serve every single person they impact. I am a servant in this situation. How can I be of help? And sometimes that means you just endure the cascade. I have a very wild client who will say, you know, you don't tell me what to do, and this and that and this and that, and I just listen it out. And at times I'll say, I appreciate it, but it is very important that I, in fact, do not tell you whether to leave this company or not. That's not the right thing to do. My job is to help you think. And, blah, 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 some more, and just repeating it. But what helped me is, this is not about me. The other part of that is really, again, mindfulness. Very often I'll be diaphragmatically breathing and really just sort of stepping into, again, the servant leadership, self-nurturance, and calming. If you can get to calm, if you can't get to calm, then also have faith in the coaching process. Just when you can, ask a question. So you've been really telling me what you think. What's that like? So just asking the question. Sometimes it activates them, in which case just weather the storm. And then when you feel ready to, and when you have a glimmering of an opening, then you can say, I'd like to share some observations with you. I believe I have just witnessed and experienced the very thing that your reports do that they find extremely difficult. What I've noticed is, you've raised your voice, you've slammed the desk, you have not been able to listen or slow down, you have ratcheted yourself up and up and up, you must be feeling terrible, and this is what your people are experiencing. Is this serving you? So that's one thing. I did do a wisecrack once, which the person was rather loud, and I said, gee, when we talked a lot about practicing on this behavior, I didn't mean practice it on me, but to practice managing it. So occasionally and the guy just laughed and then said, if anybody else said this to me, I'd fire their ass. I also use humor because that's one of my strengths. They'll go on and on, well, I'm just going to tell the faculty this and this and this. And I'll say, that's a great idea. It would work perfectly. You would get everybody even more disengaged. More faculty would quit. Your reputation would go down. It's a brilliant intervention you're making if that's your goal. So again, use your own personality in order to try and wake these people up. When I talked about the intervention I used with that first guy, when I said eventually, are you comfortable being evil? Or when he said he's Machiavellian, I said, well, have you actually read the book and life is different now? And I went to a friend of mine, this guy, Sir John Whitmore, and for supervision myself, and I'm like, John, this is what I said. Like, was that coaching? And he's like, yes, Carol, that was coaching. You can ask people wonderful questions like, well, what do you want for breakfast? What would you like to do after breakfast? But if they're asleep, your questions won't make a difference. Find a way to wake them up. So that made me feel a little better. And again, often that's our work, but we have to stay in the servant, loving place. We have to bond with them first. You have to find something about them, because you cannot confront someone more than you care about them. And sometimes I'll go an entire session and my only goal is to like the client. Like, how can I like the client? What can I like? And then I can move in and I have the freedom to confront them, but not before then.
That's great. I want to just add to that. I'm loving how you're also reflecting on your own strengths, and I hope everyone is taking that in and sort of assimilating the thought process around what do you personally bring to the relationship. And I know for myself, one of the things that I will constantly try to remember whenever put in like that stress moment with the client is that I actually don't have the same stake in the outcome. In that the whole reason the coach is there, the whole reason I'm there is because I'm not part of the organizational family. So just to remind myself, oh, I'm not in this system. I get to leave.
Although sometimes the stakes are high because you're going to get fired. with this first guy who clearly was a traumatic client for me, that it was very, very helpful to me that I was able to help this guy. When I was going to really confront him, I remember thinking, here's the setup. This is the very beginning of the gig. Millions of dollars are on the line, and not my millions, of whether we get the gig. The week before, the head of leadership and development said, you need to know whether you guys get this gig or not is dependent on so-and-so's response to you. So-and-so would only work with me because I had the pedigree. He said this thing about, they're not wrong, I don't lose control, I scream and I choose who I'm going to destroy. At that moment, I had something very powerful to say to him. And in my mind, I'm like, we're not going to get the gig. And another person I'd gone to for supervision earlier in my career is David Peterson, who's the head of coaching at Google. And he said to me, you know, Carol, if you ever want to say something to a client and you're reasonably sure they're going to get fired, if you don't say it, you're not doing your job. And at that moment, that inner support really helped me. I stepped in and said, I need to do what this person needs in this moment, and I cannot be influenced by everybody getting or losing their job. And I was able to step into that headset through my own sense of purpose and let, am I going to get the gig, go or not? And I really do believe that centering yourself and serving your client in those modes and practicing that a lot in your life so it's there when you need it is really key.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think that's really powerful. Just to have in the back of your mind that you know you will be okay if this engagement doesn't go beyond tomorrow.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
We're getting a bunch of questions around the 360, and I think it would be great for you to spend a couple of minutes on this. There's a lot of different frames that people are coming at it from, but I think the core question is, what if the 360 actually triggers even more stress for this kind of client? In other words, you know, you've gone ahead and been given permission to collect data, and they went along with it because you created that sense of safety and that this would be valuable, but then they either read it or you feed it back to them, and it's pretty strong stuff. And so, you know, they either go deeper into denial or they get reactive, or they, you know, it actually causes the very behavior you're trying to get at. So the best, I guess, your thoughts or best practices around how to work with 360 feedback when it really does connect to some pretty noxious behavior.
Hi, I'm sorry. I'm laughing because it's such a been there, done everything wrong.
A lot of people asking.
Right. So this, I think, actually 360s could be a whole nother teleclass. What I've done varies widely. A lot of times I'll let them vent, and then I'll say, so the story thing. So listen, this is just the story people have of you. Are you interested in changing the story? And what's the sense of what might happen to you if you don't take this on? So that's sort of one route to go. Another time I had someone who became so agitated, like they just turned into a raging tiger. I just put up the stool in front of me and backed away. I stopped the 360. They just went crazy. And so it was not going to do anything. I did later refer them to a psychiatrist, and they went, which helped. But sometimes you just can't. Or you can just give a tiny bit. A big one also is I'll look through and I'll say, so listen, which of these behaviors is a bit intriguing to you? Even just a little. And if they say none, I go, which one do you think is like the stupidest? Just to get them talking and to have them talking long enough and develop enough trust and relationship, which is hard sometimes when you've got like 2 sessions or 1 session, but it can be done. Then you just let them deactivate so they can hear you. Because if someone is having a seizure, it's really hard to talk to them. So you have to wait till the seizure passes and do everything you can to be supportive and delicate and sometimes soothing to them just to help them downshift. And you can even ask them that, to say, listen, this is making you crazy right now. I totally understand that. Is it possible to downshift a bit so we can have a conversation? If you want one. If you don't want a conversation, we don't have to. So that's it, is how you can really kind of calm them down. The deep in denial one, again, it's how do you wake them up? And some people cannot be woken up. And it's really important to know, you as a coach are not responsible for their capacity to open up or to not open up. And I think that is an important one. I think it's a minority of clients, but it can happen. And then you just try to have any conversation you can to finish out the hour with some dignity and possibly get them to just open the door a tiny bit. You know, listen, we have to end now, but just, you know, mull this stuff over, see if anything lands for you. So those are some of the things I've done.
That's great.
And of course,
let me.
Yeah,
Sure,
and of
ahead.
course, then one person actually said to me, you got all this feedback because you asked the wrong questions. You know, I've heard from people that when they were talking to you, you were taking so many notes that they didn't feel like they could tell you anything. So you haven't heard about me at all.
Wow.
That person, I just said, oh, I'm so sorry that my note-taking really interfered like that. Might a couple people be willing to talk to me again and I won't take notes? You can be sure they did not take me up on that suggestion, by the way. But oddly enough, they did ask me to coach them. And let's just say it's been a rough ride.
I mean, it just demonstrates that often that kind of leader will choose whatever they have in front of them to create that barrier of, you know, reality check, right? Whether it's your note-taking or...
Yes. And that particular person, who is the second most difficult person I have ever coached, and I've been coaching her now for a couple of years, at one point she became quite abusive to me. And I was even calling the woman from overseas because she was having an issue. And with her, I just at one point said, you must stop. And she said it. I said, you must stop. And then I said, if you do not stop, our relationship is over. Now you are fired. Will you stop now, yes or no? She stopped. And that is like the most strongest I've ever had to be. She was out of control. And in her case, the limit setting worked. But remember, our job is not to endure the abuse. And there are times you do need to end the coaching engagement because you have become an object. Or this person, you know, had been like this for 5 or 10 sessions, and it's like, no, I'm exaggerating, probably 3 sessions. It felt like 10. But that was the appropriate behavior, was for me to end, to say we're ending now. I don't think anything else would have worked. But it was horrible.
And hopefully you have a number
What a great note to end on.
Yeah, I was going to say you have a number of examples that operate on a more positive trajectory.
But I want to share that because I think a lot of us have these awful experiences and think it's like our fault. And yes, we have a role. But, you know, if it feels Sisyphean that you're rolling the same boulder up the same hill over and over again, this is not our fault. And I think it's also really important for us to share how we bombed, because we all do. And it's very important not to hold any shame about that or sense of lack of confidence. The good news is 90% of the time, people really get enlightened and they see things they didn't see before. They see strengths. They use new strengths. Most of the time, I find these really tough leaders really, really can improve. And the key is developing a strong relationship and bond with them, and then they will listen to you.
That's great. And I just want to add to that, Carol, that I think that this is one area where coaching is probably the most powerful intervention, because there's often the clients, the organizational clients, the HR folks will say, you know, we have training programs, we have leadership development, whatever we have that we put in place to support our leaders' growth. But when it comes to this kind of behavior, there is nothing that works as well as a good coaching engagement. So
that sounds like the perfect end.
Yeah,
Again, I want to remind everyone to please, so Jeff, you'll pass on all the questions, but send us more questions. I'm not sure of the best email. At the very least, do info@instituteofcoaching.org, and I will get them. But I'm very interested in knowing what questions, feedback, maybe even some vignettes that you could share with me. I would really love to hear them.
Yes, and so I want to thank you, Carol, for taking the time to put this together and to share your insights with our audience. And I also want to thank everyone who wrote questions and engaged with me in their comments along the way. And I feel free to use my email, which is jeff.hull@theinstituteofcoaching.org, to make sure that we pass these questions on to Carol. And there's quite a few that we weren't able to get to, so I apologize for that. But we definitely do want to keep the dialogue going, so we will be sure to follow up with you. So thank you very much, everyone, for taking the time, for joining us today. And I guess it's that time of year to say have a wonderful holiday, and we will all see you in January.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care. Bye-bye.